The envelope was still sitting on the kitchen counter when I got home from my shift. I remember standing there in my apron, smelling like espresso and steamed milk, staring at it like it might bite me. Inside was a cashier's check for $14,000, every penny of the engagement money his family had contributed, every cent we'd collected in gift cards and cash at our engagement party, bundled together and returned. I had put it all in that envelope myself, sealed it, and left it for him. And I hadn't cried once. That was 18 days before what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Let me back up because none of this makes any sense without the 8 years that came before it. My name is Nora Calloway. I'm 47 years old, and I've been pulling espresso shots at a little cafe called the Tidal Cup on the waterfront here in Sandport, North Carolina, since before most of my regulars were old enough to drink coffee. Sandport is one of those coastal towns that looks like a postcard: narrow streets, salt-bleached storefronts, pelicans sitting on the dock pilings like they own the place. Tourists flood in every summer and then drain out by October, and the rest of us who actually live here breathe again. It's the kind of town where everybody knows your name, your order, and usually your business too, whether you want them to or not. I'm not the kind of woman who spent her 30s dreaming about a wedding. I raised my daughter Priya mostly alone after her dad moved to Portland when she was 11. I worked double shifts to keep us in a decent apartment 2 blocks from the beach, and I built a life that was quiet and real and mine. I wasn't looking for anything when I met Garrett. Garrett Hollis walked into the Tidal Cup on a Tuesday morning in early March 8 years ago. I remember because it was one of those first warm days after a long, gray February, the kind where the light off the water turns everything gold, and you can almost smell spring underneath the salt air. He sat at the counter, ordered an Americano, and then asked me if the seagull on the sign outside was supposed to look angry or just confused. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. He was 51 then, recently relocated to Sandport to manage a regional accounts office for a mid-size insurance company. Divorced, no kids, steady. He had this way of listening, really listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk, that I hadn't encountered much in my life. We talked for 40 minutes that first day. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By April, we were having dinner. By June, he was fixing the garbage disposal in my apartment and staying for breakfast. By the following spring, I had keys to his house on Magnolia Terrace, a proper house, 3 bedrooms, a screened porch that looked out over the inlet, and Priya, who was 21 by then and in college down in Wilmington, called him Garrett with the good coffee, and seemed genuinely okay with him being in our lives. We were good together. I want to be clear about that because it's easy in hindsight to say you always knew something was wrong, and I don't want to lie to you. For most of those 8 years, we were genuinely, ordinarily good. We had our rhythms. I was at the cafe by 5:30 most mornings. He was up by 7, and he'd drive by on his way to the office, and I'd have his Americano waiting on the counter. We spent Sundays on the porch, reading or watching boats move through the inlet. We argued about things that normal people argue about, whose turn it was to deal with the HOA paperwork, whether to spend Thanksgiving in Sandport or drive up to see his brother in Virginia. Small things, livable things. His family was based mostly up in the Raleigh area, about 3 hours inland. His mother, Diane, was 73 and sharp as a tack, the kind of woman who could compliment you and cut you open at the same time, and you wouldn't feel the blade until you were already in the car going home. She had never said anything directly unkind to me, but from the very first time Garrett brought me to a family dinner, about 2 years into our relationship, I noticed the way she looked at me. Not with hostility exactly, more like appraisal. Like I was a used car she was trying to decide whether Garrett was overpaying for. His sister Renata was different. Renata was 44, lived in Cary with her husband and 2 teenagers, and she was warm in that slightly performative way that some people are. Lots of hugging, lots of, "we absolutely have to get together soon." Very little actual follow-through. She had never done anything to hurt me, but she was close with Garrett in that particular way that some siblings are, where they had their own language, their own shorthand, and I was always slightly outside it. And then there was Cassidy. Cassidy Hollis was Renata's daughter, Garrett's niece. She was 26 when I first met her, which would make her 34 now. She worked at Garrett's office. He had hired her about a year before we met, when she was fresh out of a 2-year business program and needed a job, and he'd done it as a favor to Renata. At the time, I thought it was sweet, the way he looked out for family. I would spend a very long time thinking about how wrong I was about that. Cassidy was the kind of person who walked into a room and recalibrated it. Not because she was loud or flashy, she wasn't. She was actually quiet, even soft-spoken, with this particular way of making herself seem fragile that I came to understand much later was entirely intentional. She had big eyes and a habit of looking slightly overwhelmed by things, and people, especially men, but not only men, responded to her by wanting to protect her. I noticed this. I filed it away. I told myself I was being paranoid. When Garrett and I got engaged last December, a quiet, private moment on the screened porch with a glass of wine and a ring he'd picked out himself, I was 56 days away from turning 47. Priya called me screaming when I told her. My coworker Deb, who has been pulling shots beside me at the Tidal Cup for 6 years, cried actual tears onto the espresso bar. We set the date for early spring, a small ceremony at the Botanical Garden on the edge of town, maybe 60 people, nothing elaborate. I had never wanted elaborate. The engagement party was in January, at Garrett's mother Diane's house in Raleigh. About 40 people, catered appetizers, a lot of champagne. Cassidy was there, of course. She worked for Garrett. She was family. She gave us a card with a $200 Crate and Barrel gift card inside and hugged me at the door and said she was so happy for us. I remember thinking she looked tired, a little pale maybe. I thought she might be coming down with something. What I didn't know, standing in Diane's living room in January, holding a flute of Prosecco and feeling for the first time in years like my life was exactly where it was supposed to be. What I didn't know was that Cassidy had already been quietly telling certain members of the family something very specific, something designed to make sure this wedding never actually happened. I didn't find out until March. Early spring again, like a cruel joke. The same gold light off the water, the same smell of something starting. I was on a closing shift at the Tidal Cup when Garrett walked in 40 minutes before we were due to lock up. He never came by on closing shifts. I knew something was wrong the second I saw his face. He sat at the counter, the same counter where he'd ordered his first Americano 8 years ago, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. I kept wiping down the steam wand. I kept my hands moving because some part of me already understood that if I stopped moving, whatever he was about to say would land harder. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me get through the whole thing before you say anything." I set down the cloth. I looked at him. "Okay," I said. What he told me next took about 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind his head the entire time, the way you focus on something fixed when the room starts to tilt. And when he was done talking, I stood there in my apron, in the cafe where we had met, 18 days before our wedding, and I understood that the last 8 years of my life had just cracked straight down the middle. He had not married his coworker. That part of what I eventually told people is true, but it's also the simplest version of a much stranger and more calculated story. The truth was worse, in a way, because it wasn't about passion or betrayal in the way you might expect. It was about Cassidy, and it was about a lie she had been constructing for months, and it was about a family that had let her build it brick by brick while I stood there making their coffee and thinking I was finally safe. I asked him one question when he finished. "How long have you known?" He looked down at the counter. 3 weeks, he said quietly. 3 weeks. He had known for 3 weeks and said nothing. The wedding invitations had already gone out. The deposit on the Botanical Garden was non-refundable. My dress was hanging in the back of my closet in a dry cleaning bag. I nodded. I picked up the cloth again. I finished wiping down the steam wand. "You should go home," I said. "I'll close up." He started to say something else. I could hear it forming. that particular intake of breath before an explanation or an apology, and I looked at him, just once, with everything I had. And he stopped. He got up. He left. I locked the front door of the Title Cup at 9:02 that night, walked to my car in the parking lot behind the building, and sat there for 22 minutes in the dark. The inlet was right there, just past the seawall. I could hear it, water moving against pilings, the occasional cry of something out in the dark. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. Not because I was strong or because I didn't feel it. I felt it the way you feel a burn, that first second before the pain fully registers, when everything is just heat and the knowledge that something has gone wrong. I didn't cry because I was already thinking. And when I'm thinking, really thinking, I go very quiet. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, and I started writing down everything Garrett had told me, every detail, every name, every date. Because something about the story he'd given me didn't add up. There were gaps in it, small ones, the kind you might not notice if you were too busy being devastated to pay attention. But I was paying attention. Cassidy had told Garrett's mother that she was sick, seriously sick. That was where it started. And that was the first loose thread dot. Cassidy had told Garrett's mother that she was sick, seriously sick. That was where it had started, not with passion, not with some late night at the office that turned into something it shouldn't have, but with a story. A carefully constructed, thoroughly rehearsed story. I sat at that kitchen table until past 2 in the morning, writing on my legal pad, going back over everything Garrett had told me. The tea went cold. I didn't touch it. I just kept writing, kept reconstructing the timeline the way you reconstruct an accident scene, walking it backward, looking for where the skid marks actually began. Here is what Garrett had told me, as best as I could piece it together. Sometime in late November, about 6 weeks before he proposed to me, Cassidy had gone to Diane and told her she had been diagnosed with something serious. She'd been vague about the specifics, Diane said later, something cardiac, something that might require surgery, something that had the doctors concerned. She'd asked Diane not to tell anyone yet, especially not Garrett, because she didn't want to be a burden. And Diane, sharp as a tack in most situations, but with a particular blind spot when it came to her grandchildren, had kept the secret. For weeks. What Cassidy had actually told Garrett was different. She hadn't said she was sick. What she'd told him, according to what he described to me in the cafe that night, was that she was in trouble. Legal trouble, she'd said. Something to do with a former boyfriend, a restraining order situation that had gotten complicated, a man who was showing up at her apartment and she was scared and didn't know who else to turn to. She'd come to him as her employer, she'd said, as her uncle. She just needed help navigating it. I wrote that down. I underlined it twice, because here was the first gap. Cassidy had told Diane she was sick. She had told Garrett she was in legal trouble. 2 different stories told to 2 different people, neither of whom had apparently compared notes. And both stories had the same function. They required Garrett's attention, his presence, his protection. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called in sick to the Title Cup for the first time in 4 years. Deb covered for me without asking questions, because Deb is the kind of person who understands when something is wrong without needing to be told. I sat back down at the kitchen table with my laptop and my legal pad, and I started making calls. The first call I made was to Priya. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant, because she knows me, she had probably been waiting for me to call. Priya is 29 now, finishing a master's in public health administration at UNC Wilmington, and she has my same quality of going very still and very quiet when something serious is happening. She didn't gasp. She didn't say anything dramatic. She just listened while I told her everything. And when I was done, there was a pause, and then she said, "Mom, what do you need?" "I need you to not panic," I said. "I'm not panicking. What do you need?" "I need to know if what Garrett told me is even possible, legally. Can a person actually—" I had to stop and reframe the question because I still hadn't fully formed it in my head. If someone runs a scheme like this, if they manufacture a situation to get close to someone, is that something that has a name? Legally? I could hear Priya typing. She has a friend from her undergrad, a woman named Theodora, who went to law school down in Charlotte. Within 20 minutes, Priya had Theodora on a three-way call. I won't pretend Theodora told me anything actionable that morning. She was careful, the way law students are careful, hedging everything with, "This isn't legal advice," and "You'd really need to consult a licensed attorney in North Carolina." But she did tell me something useful. She told me that what I was describing, if it had involved any kind of financial fraud, any misrepresentation to obtain money or gifts or material benefit, had teeth, real teeth. And she said something else that I wrote down in capital letters on my legal pad. Document everything. Every text, every email, every conversation you can remember. Write it down now while it's fresh. Date it. Don't send it anywhere, don't show it to him. Just create the record. I spent the rest of that day doing exactly that. I also spent part of that day doing something I am not proud of, but which I am not going to apologize for either. I went through the past 8 months of Garrett's credit card statements. I had access to his accounts. We had been living largely intertwined lives for 6 years. I had his login information for the joint savings account we'd opened together to save for the wedding. And from that account, I could navigate to the linked cards. I know that's a gray area. I don't particularly care. I was looking for something specific. I found it. Between September and February, 5 months, spanning from before his proposal to me through the engagement party in January, there were 17 charges to a restaurant in downtown Raleigh called The Lantern. Dinner prices, wine prices, not expensed to his work account, not split with anyone I could see. The charges ranged from $60 to $230, and they were always on Tuesday nights. I sat back in my chair and I stared at that screen for a long time. Garrett worked from the Sandport office Monday through Thursday. He drove up to the Raleigh regional headquarters about twice a month for meetings. Cassidy worked at the Sandport office. There was no professional reason for him to be at a restaurant in downtown Raleigh 17 times in 5 months on Tuesday nights. I didn't confront him. I wanted to. Every part of me that had spent the previous night not crying wanted to pick up the phone and scream. Instead, I went back to my legal pad and I wrote down every date, every amount. I cross-referenced them against the calendar on my phone, the one where I track my shifts, our plans, his travel schedule. 7 of those Tuesday nights, I had been working closing shifts. 3 of them, I had specifically noted that Garrett had said he was staying late at the office. I folded the legal pad, put it in my tote bag, and I did something I should have done 8 years earlier. I called my own mother. My mother, Cecilia Calloway, is 71 years old and lives 40 minutes north of Sandport, in a small house she has owned outright since 1998. She is a retired county records clerk and possibly the most organized human being I have ever known. When my father left when I was 9, she raised me and my brother Damien alone on a government salary and never once acted like she was doing anything remarkable. She is not a warm woman in the way that some mothers are warm. She doesn't hug easily. She doesn't say "I love you" unprompted. But she is steady in the way that granite is steady. You can build on her. I drove up that afternoon. I sat at her kitchen table, not my kitchen table, not the table where the envelope was still sitting, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is something she is very good at. When I finished, she refilled her coffee cup, sat back down and said, "How much money is in that joint account?" $11,400, I said. Most of it is from my shifts over the last 8 months. The deposit contribution from his family was separate. That's what's in the envelope. Is your name on the account? Both names. She nodded. Then the first thing you do tomorrow morning is take your half out and put it somewhere he can't touch. I hadn't even thought of that. I had been so focused on the legal pad, the credit card statements, the timeline, I hadn't thought about the money that was just sitting there, accessible to both of us, while I was trying to figure out what he'd done. "Mom," I said. "Nora, what if I'm wrong about some of this? What if there's an explanation I'm not seeing?" She looked at me the way she had looked at me when I was 12 and told her I thought maybe my father would come back. Not unkindly, just with the particular precision of someone who has seen enough of the world to know the difference between hope and wishful thinking. "There might be," she said, "but you can put the money back if you're wrong. You can't put it back if you're right and you waited." I drove back to Sandport that evening in the dark. I took the coastal route instead of the highway, the one that runs right along the water, because I needed the sound of the ocean and I needed the time to think without arriving anywhere too quickly. My headlights swept across the dunes and the sea oats, and I thought about 8 years. I thought about Tuesday nights. I thought about a woman with big eyes who had a talent for seeming fragile. And I thought about Diane, because here was the thing that had been nagging at me since I first sat down with my legal pad. Garrett had told me that Diane knew, that when he'd finally confronted Cassidy 3 weeks ago, when the whole thing had started to unravel, Cassidy had broken down and admitted to Diane what she'd done, or some version of it. And Diane had called Garrett and told him he needed to tell me, which meant Diane had sat in her living room in Raleigh in January, watching me hold a Prosecco flute and feeling safe and happy, and she had known, or suspected, or at minimum, she had known that something about Cassidy's behavior around the engagement was not right, and she had said nothing. She had hugged me at the door, she had clinked her glass against mine, and she had said nothing. I pulled into my parking space at the apartment complex at 9:15. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I took out my phone and I opened a new contact. I typed, "Diane Hollis." I didn't call her. Not yet. But I wrote down the date and the time and a single sentence underneath her name. What did you know and when did you know it? Because I was done being the woman who didn't ask that question. The envelope was still on the kitchen counter when I came inside. I picked it up. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of $14,000 in a paper rectangle. Then I set it back down, exactly where I'd left it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to give it back yet. There was something I needed to find out first, something that Garrett had mentioned almost in passing, a single detail that I had circled 3 times on my legal pad and hadn't been able to explain. He had said that Cassidy had told him the legal trouble with the former boyfriend had required her to hire an attorney, that the retainer had been $5,000, and that she'd asked Garrett to loan her the money because she couldn't afford it out of pocket. He had given it to her, and I wanted to know if that attorney, if there even was an attorney, had ever actually been hired. The answer came faster than I expected, and from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Priya called me back the following morning. This was now 2 days after Garrett had walked into the title cup and cracked my world in half, and she said, "Theodora found something." Her voice had that particular flatness she gets when she's trying to stay calm for my benefit. The North Carolina State Bar publishes attorney disciplinary records. It also publishes a searchable directory of licensed attorneys. Theodora ran the name Cassidy gave Garrett, the attorney she supposedly hired. And? There's no one by that name licensed in North Carolina. Not currently, not in the past 10 years. I set my coffee mug down on the counter very carefully because my hands had started to shake in that slow, deep way that has nothing to do with temperature. "So there was no attorney," I said. "There was no attorney," Priya confirmed, "which means there was probably no restraining order situation, and there was definitely no $5,000 retainer." I looked out the window at the inlet. A pelican was sitting on the nearest piling, completely still, watching the water. "She took $5,000 from him," I said, "by inventing a crisis." "That's wire fraud if she used any electronic communication to set it up," Priya said. Theodora was very specific about that. I thanked her. I hung up. I picked up my legal pad. Then I did the thing I had been building toward for 2 days. I called Diane Hollis. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could tell immediately that she'd been expecting to hear from me. There was a particular quality to her voice, a bracing, like someone who has been standing in a cold wind long enough that they've stopped flinching. "Nora," she said, "just my name, no hello." "Diane," I said, "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth. Not what's comfortable, not what protects anyone, the truth." A pause. "All right?" When did you know that Cassidy's story about being sick was a fabrication? The silence that followed was long enough that I counted 8 seconds. I know because I was watching the clock again, the way I had in the cafe when Garrett was talking. And then Diane said, in a voice that was smaller than I had ever heard from her, "I suspected in February, after the engagement party. She seemed too fine. If you are genuinely ill enough to require surgery, you do not look the way she looked at that party. But you said nothing. She's my granddaughter, Nora." "I understand that," I said, "and I'm going to ask you to understand something in return. She took $5,000 from your son by lying to him. She spent 5 months manufacturing a situation designed to keep him emotionally dependent on her and unavailable to me. And you sat in your living room in January and watched me celebrate my engagement, and you said nothing. I need you to sit with that." Another silence. When Diane spoke again, her voice was completely different, not smaller, but stripped of the particular armor she usually wore. "You're right," she said. "I was wrong. I told myself I wasn't sure enough to say anything, but I was protecting her because I didn't know how to not protect her, and I left you to walk into something you didn't deserve." She stopped. "I'm sorry, Nora. I mean that." I believed her. I wasn't sure it changed anything, but I believed her. "I need one more thing from you," I said. "I need you to be willing to say what you just told me, to Garrett, in front of me. All of it. What you suspected and when." She didn't hesitate this time. "Yes," she said, "I'll do that." We met 3 days later. Garrett's kitchen table on Magnolia Terrace. Not my apartment, not neutral ground, his house, because I wanted him uncomfortable in his own space. I arrived at 7 in the evening. Diane drove down from Raleigh and arrived 10 minutes after me. Garrett stood in his own kitchen looking like a man who understood he was about to be held accountable for something and couldn't quite decide which part to brace for. I had the legal pad. I had printed copies of the credit card statements, 17 Tuesday nights at the Lantern highlighted in yellow. I had the screenshot Priya had taken of the State Bar directory search, showing no attorney by the name Cassidy had given Garrett. And I had something else, something Deb had found for me, because Deb's daughter works at the county courthouse and had pulled the civil court records on request. There had been no restraining order filed in any North Carolina county in the past 2 years that named Cassidy Hollis as a petitioner. Not one. I laid all of it on Garrett's kitchen table, piece by piece, without saying a word. He looked at each page. His face went through several things: confusion, recognition, something that might have been grief, and then a settling, like a building after an earthquake, where the structure finally stops moving and you can see the actual damage. Diane sat across from him and told him what she had told me on the phone. She was clear and she was precise, and she did not soften it. She said she had suspected in February. She said she had chosen silence. She said she was wrong. Garrett listened to his mother say this, and I watched something happen in his face that I don't have a clean word for. It was the look of a person realizing that the architecture of a thing they trusted had been hollow all the way down. When Diane finished, Garrett looked at me. "Nora," he said. "Don't," I said. Not unkindly, just clearly. "I know what you're going to say. You're going to tell me you didn't know, and I believe you didn't know all of it. But you knew enough. You knew you were having Tuesday night dinners at the Lantern for 5 months and you didn't tell me. You knew you'd given her $5,000 and you didn't tell me. You let the distance between us grow and you called it stress, and you let me plan a wedding while you were keeping secrets. That's not the same as what she did. But it's not nothing either." He didn't argue. That was the thing. He didn't argue. He just sat there with his hands flat on the table and nodded slowly, like a man accepting a sentence he knows is fair. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I already did it," I said. That morning, before driving to Magnolia Terrace, I had transferred my portion of the joint wedding savings account, $5,700, every cent I had contributed, into my personal account. I had also spoken to Theodora's colleague, a licensed attorney in Wilmington named Marcus Feld, who handled civil fraud cases, and he had agreed to send a formal demand letter to Cassidy on my behalf, not Garrett's, mine, because some of the gifts at the engagement party in January had come from my own network, my own people, who had given in good faith based on a future that Cassidy's behavior had helped to destroy. The letter outlined the fraudulent misrepresentation, the $5,000 loan obtained under false pretenses, and the potential for a civil fraud claim if the money was not repaid within 30 days. I also handed Garrett the envelope, the one that had been sitting on my kitchen counter, $14,000 in a cashier's check, his family's engagement contribution, the gift cards, the cash from the party, all of it. "This goes back to the people it came from," I said. "Your family's money goes back to your family. The gifts from my side I'll handle myself. I've already sent notes." He took the envelope. His hands were not steady. "The wedding deposit," he said. "The botanical garden. That's non-refundable." "I know," I said. "That one's on you." I picked up my legal pad, put my copies back in my tote bag, and I stood up from the table. Diane stood too, and for a moment we looked at each other across Garrett's kitchen. Two women who had both, in different ways and for different reasons, let things go unsaid too long. She reached out and put her hand briefly on my arm. Not a hug, just contact. I accepted it. "Take care of yourself," she said. "I will," I said. "You too." I drove home along the coastal route again. The windows were down this time, even though it was cold enough that I should have had the heat on. I wanted the air. I wanted the smell of the inlet and the sound of water, and the particular quality of dark that you only get right at the edge of the ocean, where the sky and the sea are both so big that you stop feeling like your own problems are the most important thing in the universe. Cassidy paid back the $5,000. Not all at once. It came in 2 wire transfers, the first for $3,000 and the second for $2,000, both within the 30-day window Marcus's letter had specified. I suspect Renata helped her with it. I don't know that for certain, and I didn't ask. What I know is that the money went directly to Garrett, who had been the one defrauded, and Garrett donated it in full to the Sandport Community Food Bank, which I only know because Deb saw the acknowledgement letter in the local paper and texted me a photo of it at 6:45 in the morning with 3 exclamation points. Cassidy left Garrett's office about 6 weeks later. Whether she resigned or was asked to leave, I don't know, and I genuinely don't care. That chapter closed the way chapters close, not with a dramatic scene, but with a door quietly shutting. Garrett and I did not reconcile. I want to be honest about that, because I think sometimes people expect a story like this to bend back toward the beginning, to find its way to forgiveness and reset, and a new version of the same life. That's not what happened. What happened was that I understood, finally and completely, that the 8 years we had been good together were real. I still believe that. I haven't revised it into something ugly. But that what the last 5 months had revealed was a man who, when faced with a manufactured crisis, had chosen to carry it alone rather than trust me with it, and I had spent enough of my life being the woman other people didn't quite trust with the hard things. I kept my apartment on the coast. I kept my shifts at the Tidal Cup. I kept my regulars, my counter, my 5:30 mornings, and the particular gold that the light off the water does on the first warm days after a long gray winter. Priya came home for a long weekend in late April. She slept on my couch, and we ate takeout from the Thai place on Harbor Street and watched 2 movies I'll never remember the names of. And at some point around midnight she said, "Are you okay? Like actually okay, not the thing you tell people." I thought about it. "I think I'm going to be," I said. "That's a real answer," she said. "Yeah," I said. "I'm getting better at those." She fell asleep shortly after that, her feet tucked under my throw blanket, her face completely relaxed, the way it used to be when she was small, and the world hadn't complicated itself yet. I sat for a while longer in the quiet, listening to the water outside, the inlet doing what it always does, moving, adjusting, finding its level, patient and indifferent and completely unbothered by anything that happens on the shore. I thought about the envelope, about the weight of $14,000 in a paper rectangle, and how it had felt to hold it, and how it had felt to give it back. Not like losing something, like setting something down that I had been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. My mother always said that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is confuse safety with the presence of another person. It took me 47 years and 8 years and 18 days to fully understand what she meant. Some lessons don't arrive on a schedule. They arrive when they arrive, and you can either pick them up or walk past them. And the ones that cost the most to learn are usually the ones you carry the most carefully afterward. I didn't walk past this one. That's the only part of this I'm certain of. The only thing I'd tell anyone sitting across from me at that counter, ordering their Americano, looking like they're trying to hold something together with both hands and running out of grip. You can put the money back if you're wrong. You can't put it back if you're right and you waited. My mother said that. She was right. She usually is.